So going back over to Guzik, looks like we finished the part that I was really concerned about with Guzik. We don't really need to read through the rest of the notes here, because actually when we go back over to Matthew and look past the two women grinding at the middle, one will be taken, one will be left, and things like that, I mentioned last week that I take the perspective that Matthew 24, the passages that the part that we're looking at here, is actually a reference to the rapture, not to a second coming. I realize when I say second coming that is the title given to the overall time period of Yeshua coming back as parousia. There's only one. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there are two. There is only one parousia. And if you translate the word parousia as second coming, then I would say there's only one second coming. But the second coming is divided into those two bookends. Rapture on the left, second coming on the right. And the rapture is the part that initiates the second coming, and the second coming on the far right of the chart that I showed you earlier is the part that concludes the second coming, if you want to call it that. Well, who is going to be taken and who will be left? It depends on whether you think this is rapture or whether you think this is second coming. So with that, we had one final slide that I showed you last week that fits basically the theology that I hold to. The rapture in this chart refers to the Christians who are taken. That's the taken principle, taken language in Yeshua's words in Matthew. Two will be taken, two will be in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. The Christians at rapture time are taken, and the wicked at the rapture time will be left behind. I think Tim LaHaye got it right in that aspect. Comparison and contrast to that, at the second coming of Christ, which is, by my reckoning, at least more than a year later, at least more than 5 months, we'll put it that way, and I'll tell you why later, but at least 5 months later, but certainly not 7 years later. I don't hold to a 7-year tribulation, a 7-year wrath of God model. But if you're pre-tribber and classic dispensationalists, like most Christians are, you're going to see these two events on my screen as separated by 7 years. Okay, but the principle is the same. Whether you smash this into, like I said, about a year and a half or two, like I do, or extend it all the way out to 7 years, like most Christians do. Either way, the principle is generally the same. Rapture, Christians are taken, wicked are left. Second coming, the wicked are taken and Christians are left to go into either millennial kingdom or to go into New Jerusalem while the Jews occupy the millennial kingdom, something like that. So that's what's going on. Now with that, we can turn right into Tim Hague and take the last half of our show and deal with this idea from Tim Hague's perspective. You're listening to Live Internet Studies with your host, Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi, and we are working our way through a study entitled Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. We're working our way towards the book of Revelation, but we're going through the relevant passages in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, with a view towards Revelation, which includes the book of Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, Luke chapter 17, and Luke chapter 21. We'll eventually also pull in a little bit of detail from 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. There's some relevant information for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 from Paul. And then eventually there's also some notes from Peter in his 2 letters. And then we're ready for the book of Revelation, basically. But let's look at Tim Hague's notes. This is available in a commentary that he wrote to the book of Matthew, which is available at his own resource, which is torahresource.com. And this is it's basically a seminary level commentary, verse by verse, through the book of Matthew. I'll flash a little graphic on the screen in post-production, which shows the URL to his website and things like that in case you're interested in purchasing this. It's not a very expensive commentary, so it's well within most people's budget. But let me read down through a portion of this. In the first part of this commentary to Matthew 24, this is what Tim Hague has to say. Let me see if I can highlight this. And nope, this won't work. Let's see if that works. Nope. So I'm not able to do my little trick of where I'm highlighting each word that I'm saying at the time. You're just going to have to follow along with your eyes. Here's what Tim has to say. I'll see if I can read without stopping. This whole matter of the sequence of events which Yeshua describes in the Olivet Discourse brings to the table the idea of his imminent return and how the word imminent is variously understood primarily by evangelicals. Generally, Tim says, the English word imminent means impending. And if applied to the return of Yeshua, would mean that his coming was near or impending. But that is not generally how evangelical theologians use the word in connection with the return of Yeshua, also commonly called the parousia, a Greek word, parousia meaning presence, coming, or advent. He goes on to say, in eschatological dimensions or discussions, imminent has a sense of at any time, quote unquote, meaning that the return of Yeshua could happen at any time. Those who hold that nothing else in world history needs to occur before his return take the concept of imminent to mean at any second. That is, his coming could take place right now. Other evangelicals understand the imminent return of Yeshua to mean at any period or in any generation, opening the door to the possibility that there may still be events prophesied in Scripture which must take place before the parousia. Tim Hegg continues, this brings up the question about the question of the signs. He put that in quotes, pointing to the return of Yeshua, and particularly the signs about which Yeshua speaks in Matthew 24. Various systems of eschatology, or more correctly, hermeneutics, have been formulated to answer this question. Well known among many evangelical groups is the classic dispensationalism. And let me just interject. Again, dispensationalism is this idea that was put forth by a gentleman, I believe his name was John Darby, something to that effect. I'll look it up and flash a little graphic on the screen that confirms my suspicion. But if I remember correctly, dispensationalism has its roots in, I think it's like 19th century Christianity, 18th century. It's not a label that's generally given to first century Christianity, first century Christian theology concerning end-time events. But dispensationalism, among other things, teaches that the church in Israel are a hard separated group of peoples, meaning there's not overlap. There are two distinct people groups of God, and God's program with the church does not overlap with his program for Israel, and thus God has to rapture the church away from the earth in order to begin his dealings with Israel, so that the two people groups are separated from one another instead of having any overlap. That's one aspect of dispensationalism that, along with Tim Hegg, I myself also soundly reject. I don't really hold to this idea that there are these dispensations where God dealt with different people groups in different ages so that there's no overlap between the people groups. Dispensationalism also likes to use language that refers to the Old Testament as an era that's bygone, that's been exhausted at this point in time in history, up to the point where the dispensation of grace is where we are now living with the church age. But once the rapture takes place, the dispensation of Israel and grace, or Israel in the Old Testament, the dispensation of Torah, will start up once again, at least enough to bring Israel to a place where God can deal with her. So Tim Hegg is not a proponent of dispensationalism. I got to give you that aspect, or else you won't understand what he's going to say. He's going to now show why dispensationalism, in its interaction with rapture, is a perspective that he rejects. So he says the first coming, according to the dispensationalists, was the birth of Yeshua and his incarnate life upon the earth, culminating in his ascension back to the Father. His second coming, he's got that word in quotes, second coming, that phrase, is in two stages. Notice this is similar in his description about what we just read from Guzik and what we also previously read from the pastor Thomas Ice. His second coming, Tim says, is in two stages. Speaking of the rapture, he calls it the rapture. This is Tim Hagg's language. The second coming, the two stages are the rapture, which takes place before any of the signs Yeshua describes in our Matthew text, which removes only the church, he's got the church in quotes there as well, out of the world, and could take place at any second. It is therefore referred to as the quote-unquote secret rapture. That phrase, secret rapture, is very popular among dispensational evangelicals, pre-tribbers, pre-millennial, pre-wrath, pre-millennial, pre-trib, pre-millennial. And so the secret rapture is something that's described as the imminent return of Christ, which does not require any sign to precede it, meaning it could happen at any time. It could happen before I finish my Oh, sorry, couldn't finish the sentence. Jesus came and raptured me away. You understand what I'm trying to say there? So that's the details that we're following through with what Tim Hegg is describing. He continues by saying that the second phase, again, quotes around that word second phase, is Yeshua's return at the end of the millennium to consummate Earth's history. Thus, in classic dispensationalism, there are actually three comings of Yeshua. Right? The first would have been at his first coming when he came as a baby in the manger and then lived his life and then was crucified, resurrected, ascended to heaven and sits at the right hand of Father. That's the first coming, if you want to call it that. And then the second coming would be the rapture. And then the third coming will be the second coming, third coming. I mean, it sounds really strange, but you know what I mean, at the end of the age. So that's why Hegg is trying to say there's actually three comings. He continues, but the fact that no passage of Scripture unambiguously teaches a quote-unquote two-stage understanding of Yeshua's return weakens the dispensational system so significantly as to, you ready for this, to render it unusable. So Tim Hegg rejects dispensationalism, and he's going to go on to say that dispensationalism is commendable, though, in its attempt to harmonize texts which appear contradictory, but it does so only by forcing an interpretation upon biblical passages which, when understood in their clear grammatical or historical sense, cannot bear. And then he goes on to conclude in this little section, a better approach is to understand the signs that we read about in Matthew 24, given by Yeshua in our passage, as having a progressive sense rather than being singular in their focus. This is commonly seen in the prophetic method of the prophets. For instance, Daniel describes events that take place only centuries from his time, but which also describe and are patterns for events in the last days. Remember, that prophetic telescoping aspect is what Tim is describing here. For instance, Daniel, okay, I already read that. Antiochus IV, that is Antiochus Epiphanes, thus becomes a portend, that is a shadow or a warning or a sign, a type and shadow for events in the last days. Antiochus is a portend of the anti-Messiah in the eschaton. And in other words, when we read, and we did this in my own study here, which I agree with, Antiochus Epiphanes is a type and shadow of the little horn, the Antichrist, the beast, the man of lawlessness that Paul describes. And the way we understand the Antichrist who is to come is by reading through the life of Antiochus Epiphanes, who at the time, even down to certain details, fulfilled partially some of the prophecies that were given in Daniel. So it was an event that was near to Daniel, and thus we can understand it that way, but at the same time, it is an event that is far away from Daniel, near and far at the same time. That's the prophetic telescoping. I'll put this in a little graphic at the end of in the post-production so you can see it. In the same way, again, the signs that would signal, Tim Hegg says, excuse me, the signs that would signal the coming disruption of the temple in 70 AD may be viewed as describing similar signs marking the events in the eschaton. When he says eschaton, he's just talking about where we get our word eschatology as well. He's talking about the end time scenario that has not happened yet. So Tim Hegg still believes something's coming down the road. He's not a preterist. Remember, preterism believes that most, if not all, of the events of Daniel, the Old Testament prophecies, the book of Revelation, etc., were all fulfilled primarily in 70 AD, with just a very few minor details, perhaps the second coming of Christ, the destruction of Antichrist at Armageddon, or maybe at least the establishment of the ushering in of the kingdom, or maybe not even that sometimes. But just almost all of the events that we read about in the Bible were all fulfilled in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and et cetera, which I do not hold to. I am a futurist. I am not a preterist. Well, Tim Hegg is also not a preterist. He would fall into the camp of futurists as well, just like me. But he's rejecting dispensationalism, and he's saying why. But he is at least saying that there are signs that are pointing to different things that take place in the end. So you can't throw dispensationalism completely out altogether, because there are a lot of details in dispensationalism that are accurate, but the theology as a whole has so many problems that Tim Hegg says that it's unusable. So he concludes by saying, given this perspective, the sense of the imminent return of Yeshua is taken to mean at any period or in any generation. So let me go back up just a bit and show you that when Tim Hegg talks about classic dispensationalism and how that no passage in Scripture unambiguously teaches a two-stage understanding of Yeshua's return, and this is what weakens the dispensational system, we have to understand that I believe what Tim Hegg is saying is that if you look at Scripture as a whole, there are not two comings that we should be looking for. There's one coming. And we're primarily basing this theology and explanation on the Old Testament, the Tanakh, right? Remember, Daniel was not shown two comings in Daniel chapter 7, 9, 10, 11, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, etc. Basically starting in chapter 7, but we can go all the way back to 2 if we need to, of Daniel. The point being here is that when the Son of Man approaches the Ancient of Days in Daniel chapter 7, for instance, there's only one approach. There are not two times that Daniel saw the Son of Man coming up to approach the Ancient Days and then it's given the kingdom. So in the broader picture sense, I want you to understand that there's only one coming. There's one parousia that was foretold in the Old Testament and that is also described in the rest of the Bible, what we call the New Testament. There is only one coming of Messiah. However, Tim Hegg has to agree that there are details that are given at either the onset of the second coming and the outset of the second coming that those of us who hold to this idea that there's two aspects, two bookends, that we're simply recognizing that this is not simply one event. There are parts of the second coming that must be relegated to one side and other parts that are to the other side. So I don't know if Tim Hegg is going to flesh that out when he talks about two-stage and things like that. He doesn't like that phrase two-stage, because he says no passage teaches it. And I think what he's pushing back against is the classic dispensational language that talks about 2 second comings. So I think that's what he's referring to there. But continuing with Tim Hegg, we want to now ask the question, who will be taken and who will be left? And is this part of Matthew talking about the rapture, or is it talking about the second coming? And Tim Hegg, if I understood his notes correctly, he does believe in what we're going to call a rapture, but he doesn't believe that it's pre-tribulational. He's more of, I think, a post-tribber. Let me pull up the chart so you can see. Here's the classic view, pre-trib. Rapture takes place at the far left of the chart. Before the 7 years even begins, it snatches the church away so that she doesn't have to go through any tribulation, i.e. God's wrath or Satan's wrath. It's the full 7-year length for that wrath. And then at the far right, Jesus comes with his saints to establish his kingdom, along with those who were raptured in the event that was on the left side of the chart. That's pre-trib. We have a contrast. Let me see. Going chronologically left to right, we have a contrasted view. This is the view I hold to, and we'll flesh this out in great detail in my next few topical studies. I won't show it to you, but topically, when we get to topic number 10, 11, and 12, I guess I do have to look at it because I always forget. 10, 11, 12, yeah. 10, 11, 12, we're going to be looking finally at the rapture, and I'm going to make a case for the pre-wrath view. So going back to, sorry, that's why I didn't want to do that, because I was going to lose my place. There we go. So in this view, Tim Hegg would probably, I'm sure he's aware of the pre-wrath view, but there's 4 kind of main views out there: pre-trib, mid-trib, pre-wrath, and post-trib, moving from left to right in the way of the charts that we're seeing. I don't have mid-trib pulled up here. I'm not interested in showing all of the views at this point in time. That's not my point. My point is simply that if we chart where rapture takes place on this chart, if we pinpoint it, you can easily see that it's not at the beginning of the 7 years, it's not at the midpoint, but it's not at the end either. That's the point. It's somewhere in the 3.5 year mark that we would call the second half. So it's kind of 3/4 of the way into the 7-year tribulation, if you want to call it the 7-year tribulation, which I don't. So this is not what Tim Hegg is espousing to. I believe, if I understood his teachings correctly, he is holding to, I believe, what many messianics hold to, which I don't, oddly enough. It's very unusual that I take a break from Tim, that I make a break with Tim Hague, because I agree with him with so many other things, but it seems to be that eschatology is not one of his strong points. At least that's my perspective. No disrespect to your teachings, Tim. So I believe he holds to a post-trib rapture, if he's even going to use the word rapture at all, which many messianics don't like. They certainly shy away from the view of that it's a secret rapture, which I myself also do. No matter which rapture view I hold to, I don't believe it's secret. It is definitely announced by signs and by shouts, by the voice of an archangel, by the trumpet of God, by the brightness of Yeshua's coming when he splits the sky, by the sky splitting apart like a scroll, by the sixth seal sign with the sun, moon, stars, earthquake, a roaring of the waves, etc., etc. It's clearly not secret in my understanding. The lightning flashing from the east to the west. So it's not secret, but there is a rapture in my understanding. Tim Hague, I'm not sure if he even holds to the word rapture in this classic sense, but I believe what he's describing, what he's going to go on to describe, is that the rapture and the second coming are very, very so closely right on top of one another as to be almost synonymous. But we still have a going up and then a coming back down very close to one another. But this view is post-trib. It's after believers and Israel have to go through everything that's being poured out on planet Earth. And it's how will God protect us? Well, it's what's known as the Goshen principle, which we'll get to in time. Just like in the Exodus story where God protected Israel supernaturally from the plagues that were befalling Egypt, he's going to do the same thing with Israel and the church when the time comes. He'll pour out wrath on planet Earth. He won't rapture us away. He'll instead protect us from the wrath that he is pouring out. And then at the far end, we'll quickly go up and then quickly come back down again, because the resurrection has to take place. Tim Hague agrees that there is a resurrection, and nearly every Christian does, and for good reason, because it's explicitly taught in Scripture. So there must be a resurrection, at the very least, a quick going up and then a quick coming back down. I think that's what Tim's going to go with. So let's pick up his discussion about who's taken and who's left during this time period that, no matter when you put it at the pre-trib, mid-trib, pre-wrath, or post-trib, wherever you place the rapture, who is taken and who is left, and why is it relevant for us? So here we got Tim's notes, and we'll finish our study tonight. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I think I can hit this in 15 minutes. And then what we'll do next week, I'm just showing you in advance, we'll turn to some more details about this timing of Yeshua's second coming with these notes from this blog post about the Feast of Trumpets and its Christian significance, and playing with this idea that we don't know the day or the hour, but we can know the season. There are details that were given in the Bible and other places, particularly to the Jewish people, which are, what do we say, kind of preserved for us in the festivals and the feasts that we read about in Leviticus chapter 23, what Christians would call the feasts of Israel, but really they're feasts of the Lord. Well, there are themes that surround the feasts that actually correspond and parallel some of the themes related to the second coming of Messiah. And we've looked at this a little bit, but now I want to turn headlong into it, and that'll kind of conclude our study on the Olivet Discourse, and then we'll be able to jump into the rapture.